In March 2026, Israel struck South Pass, Iran's side of the largest natural gas reservoir on Earth, the same reservoir that Qatar draws from. Qatar immediately asked Washington a simple question: did you know? Trump said he didn't, but Israeli sources said he greenlit it. Someone here was lying. And Qatar, a country that had spent 60 years making sure it was never caught between two powers, was now exactly there. What happened next was exactly what Qatar had feared. Iran struck Ras Laffan, Qatar's primary gas terminal operated by Qatar Energy, the one that supplies 5% of the world's liquefied natural gas. The losses were enormous. 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity was wiped out. $20 billion loss in annual revenue. And now it will take at least 5 years to recover. And Qatar was left holding the bill for a war it didn't start, a strike it didn't authorize, and an ally it could no longer fully trust. All this because Qatar made a bet that kept paying off, until it didn't. So how did Qatar get here? Let's find the link. Let's start with the geography, because Qatar is genuinely absurd as a country. It is flat, a completely flat, sun-baked peninsula, just the size of the Indian state of Tripura. There are no rivers, no mountains, no forests, but it does have a royal family. In 1961, when this story really begins, the entire population of Qatar was roughly 36,000 people only. But those 36,000 people came under the Thani clan. And the Thanis had a problem that was almost comedic in its repetition. Every time the emir went on holiday, someone tried to take his throne. Now, who benefited from Qatar being unstable? Ask that question and a pattern emerges. The British had a presence, the Saudis had influence, and inside the family itself, ambition ran deep. Qatar was so small, so young, so underdeveloped that its internal politics were almost entirely shaped by whoever had leverage over it from outside. Then, underneath all that sand, they found gas. Qatar already had oil. In 1940, it was discovered in the Toucan field. But what really transformed Qatar was when it found natural gas in 1971 in the North Field. A lot of natural gas. Basically, Qatar had struck gold. Now here's the catch. This is the single largest natural gas reservoir ever discovered. But it's a shared property, the North Dome field as Qatar calls it. But its neighbor, Iran, calls the same reservoir South Pass. They share it across a maritime border in the middle of the Persian Gulf. Think about what that means for a second. Qatar's greatest source of wealth sits in a body of water it shares with a country most likely to threaten it. And all of it, every tanker, every dollar, has to pass through a 21-mile strait called the Strait of Hormuz. So Qatar is sitting on a pile of gold, completely exposed. How do you protect a gas field that you cannot physically defend? And that's where its foreign policy comes in. By the 1990s, Qatar had a choice that almost every small, resource-rich country faces. Do you hide under a great power's umbrella and do what you're told? Or do you try to build your own leverage? Most countries choose the umbrella. Qatar chose something even more interesting. For decades, Qatar's security had depended entirely on Saudi Arabia, big brother, protector, and in exchange, as big brothers often require, compliance. Saudi Arabia expected Qatar to follow its lead on regional politics, on Iran, on Israel, on the Muslim Brotherhood, on who got to have a voice in the Arab world. In 1995, Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani flew back to Qatar and took power from his father. His father was on holiday. Some patterns, you see, are just hard to break. But Hamad was different. He wanted autonomy, and Saudi Arabia almost immediately started working to reverse the coup. The counter-coup attempt failed, and in failing, it clarified everything. Qatar could not depend on Saudi Arabia anymore. So Hamad made a calculation. If you can't rely on Saudi Arabia, you need to build so many different forms of leverage that no single power can threaten you. It's like threading a needle, and Qatar achieved it. The result was one of the most creative foreign policy portfolios in modern history. Let's go through it. Number 1, and this is the unmatched instrument of power, Al Jazeera. Launched in 1996, funded by the Qatari state, editorially independent in a way that drove every government in the region, including Saudi Arabia, absolutely crazy. Al Jazeera covered the Arab Spring with sympathy. It gave airtime to the Muslim Brotherhood. It made Qatar feel powerful in ways that tanks cannot achieve. Who benefits from a media outlet that no regional government can silence? Qatar benefits because every government that hates Al Jazeera still has to negotiate with Qatar to try and make it stop. Then number 2, the American base. The Al Udeid Airbase, built in 1996. Qatar quietly funded it, invited CENTCOM in, and made itself indispensable to American military operations across the entire West Asia region. Iraq, Afghanistan, the drone programs, it all ran through the Al Udeid base. Now, who benefits from having the largest American military base in the region on your soil? Well, Qatar benefits, because any military strike on Qatar is a strike on American forces. The US military presence was supposed to be Qatar's insurance policy. Then there's number 3, diplomatic neutrality as currency. Qatar mediated between the United States and the Taliban. It hosted Hamas's political leadership. It maintained relations with Iran. It talks to Israel. It was one of the only countries on earth that simultaneously had contact with all of those actors. Now, this is the part that confuses observers. How can Qatar fund an Islamist terror group like Hamas and host American soldiers as well? Isn't that a contradiction? Only if you think Qatar's goal is ideological consistency or combating terrorism. But that's not the goal. Qatar's goal is indispensability. It is power. You cannot cut off a country that everyone needs to talk to, that everyone needs energy from. And fourthly, soft power at scale. You see, Qatar has its ways to woo the world. Qatar Airways, the 2022 World Cup, on which Qatar spent more money than all previous World Cups combined. The lobbying infrastructure in Washington, the sovereign wealth fund buying into Western institutions, the $400 million aircraft gifted to the White House. But here's where the architecture develops cracks. In 2017, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt imposed a blockade on Qatar. They demanded Qatar shut down Al Jazeera, end its relationship with Iran, cut ties with Turkey, expel Hamas. Qatar refused every single demand. Now, who benefits from Qatar's isolation? Saudi Arabia benefits. It reasserts dominance over the Gulf. But notice who also benefits: Iran. Because when the Saudis blockaded Qatar, Qatar's only available trade routes and diplomatic lifelines ran through Turkey and through Iran. The blockade lasted 3.5 years. Qatar survived it partly by importing food through Iranian airspace. The country that Qatar was supposed to fear became the country that kept its supermarkets stocked. Now, this is where the architecture starts to show its internal tension. Qatar built its safety on balance, keeping everyone slightly engaged, slightly dependent, slightly uncertain. But balance is only stable while the underlying relationships hold. But then came October 7th, 2023. Qatar had positioned itself as the indispensable mediator. It hosted Hamas's leadership in Doha. And Israel knew this. It tolerated it, publicly disapproved, but privately permitted it, because it weakened the other Palestinian faction, the Palestinian Authority. After October 7th, the calculus exploded. Israel could no longer publicly tolerate Qatar's Hamas relationship. Qatar's mediation role, its crown jewel, became a source of international pressure rather than a source of protection. And then fast forward to the US-Iran war, and Qatar gets hit badly. Qatar's entire economic model, the wealth that funded Al Jazeera, the Al Udeid Airbase, the FIFA World Cup, the lobbying, the diplomacy, Everything runs through a bottleneck that its neighbor or enemy physically controls. The $400 million jet to Trump, the lobbying, the access, the relationships with Washington, all of that soft power could not prevent an Iranian-backed attack on Qatar's most critical piece of infrastructure. Qatar discovered gas that it could not physically protect. So it built a foreign policy designed to make itself too valuable, too connected, too expensive to attack. For decades, this worked. Qatar punched so far above its weight that its actual military capacity was almost irrelevant. Right now, Qatar needs to engineer an exit, because the link that built Qatar's empire, gas to diplomacy to security, is the same link that now traps it.